Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever and whenever you are watching or listening. This is the Holistic Monitor, and I'm your host, Nick Sconia. The Holistic Monitor podcast is a weekly show featuring guest interviews with discussions about self-discovery, philosophy, spirituality, and our relationship with the world around us. Your support this last year has meant the world to me, and you can now go to holisticmonitor.com to support the topics you want to hear with our new show merchandise, featuring hats, t-shirts, hoodies, and more. You can also support us by simply sharing your favorite episode with your followers. And with that, let's get the show started. Derrick Jensen, you are an author and a professor, and I heard you first on a TikTok clip, and that really it had a profound message to it. Unfortunately, I don't remember what the clip was. It was a while back, but I thought, this guy, I'd like to get him on the show and hear what he has to say about things in the world. So thank you for coming on to the show tonight. Really glad to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Now, I understand from what I've picked around about what you do and what you're into, that it seems radical, green, revolution, these are the kind of words that seem to come up. What are some of the obstacles that you're seeing to live in harmony as far as a species on this planet?
Well, if I had to condense all of my work to a couple sentences, or maybe one sentence, if you give me a semicolon, it would be, this way of living won't last. And when it's over, I would prefer that there is more of wild nature left rather than less. And so we can talk about any parts of that you want. Just that it's one of my books, Endgame, really begins with the premise that civilization itself, but especially industrial civilization, is inherently unsustainable, and it's systematically destroying life on the planet. And we can talk about defined civilization. We can talk, because that doesn't mean all cultures, doesn't mean all humans. What it means is a very specific way of life. So we can start there. We can start with the notion that I wrote another book about how humans consider ourselves to be the only ones who really matter. That you can read lots of accounts of the forest wastelands, and if it's, well, here's a better example, that when we think of beautiful pieces of art, we think of the Sistine Chapel, we think of Michelangelo's David, we think of Mona Lisa. We don't think of birdsong. We don't think of a sunset. Yeah. And that's because wild nature, according to our perspective, is not purposeful, is not creative, is not, or we think of the best inventions of all time. We think of the lever, the screw, the wheel, gunpowder, what have you. We don't think about metabolism or proprioception, which is how you tell where your hand is when it's behind your back.
Yeah.
Or we don't think about sex, and that's a pretty extraordinary invention that evolution created. So we think that what we create, and I can go into any direction you want with any of this, but we think that what we create with our heads is what matters, and what nature creates is not really a creation. And one way to think about some of this is Thomas Berry, who wrote The Dream of the Earth. He was a extraordinary human being. He wrote about how us destroying forests is like burning the great works of art. You wouldn't burn the Mona Lisa so that you can heat hot dogs.
Yeah.
Yet that's exactly what we're doing. So we can go that direction. We can talk about how it's really not personal. The destruction isn't my personal choices. It's the entire culture pushing us in direction. So whatever direction you want to go, I'm happy to go. I'm happy to bloviate on any of those.
Absolutely. Well, now looking at civilization, I've always wondered what the turn of events was that really spun us out of control. I know there's a lot of idealism to the Native Americans or Aborigines in general that live with the land and kind of in harmony. My understanding, even in the Americas, that the land was kind of curated, that meadows were created to make better hunting grounds. But there was a general harmony with nature or the sacred hoop, you know. But there was something that happened somewhere that spun things out of control. It seems to be some kind of tribal warfare, protectionism, building walls, building cities, condensed cultures in in the Middle East. In Egypt, you have examples of that, and something that was almost disharmonious to nature.
Well, there's a few directions that I'd like to go with that. One of them is that there were actually a lot of areas in North America that were not particularly managed. That there were a lot of places that were far in between villages or far in between communities, or would be basically battlegrounds and would be not particularly inhabited because of that. And so it's really important to me, at least, to uh, the reason I'm bringing this up is because back in the early 90s, there was this very strong movement to say, was really from the right wing, to say that nature has basically, because humans evolved and humans are natural, therefore anything humans create is natural, therefore
Mm.
chainsaws are natural, therefore clear cuts are natural.
Oh, wow.
That was sort of from the right wing. And I
How
was
about
fighting
that?
that back then. And
Yeah.
these days it comes from the left wing with it's the same story, but the opposite direction. So
Mm.
it used to be that chainsaws are the clear cuts are natural because humans are natural. And so there was no nature culture distinction. And these days, the argument is that the Amazon rainforest was a human creation,
Mm.
or
Mm-hmm.
that humans have created everything, and that nature is to use a quote to use the title of one book, a rambunctious garden.
Right.
That humans have controlled everything forever. And
Hmm.
yes, humans affect our land base, but so do capybaras, so do buffalo, so do prairie dogs. So we can talk about prairie dogs and buffalo creating the prairie just as much as we can talk about humans. But again, it's what the human influence. Like I was reading something the other day, and they really do say that the Amazon rainforest is a human creation, which is
Hmm.
silly because the Amazon rainforest existed before humans evolved. But leave that aside. Um, that I was reading something the other day about uh, what are they called? Keystone species in the Amazon, and one of the primary keystone species are Brazil nuts,
Oh,
because evidently they help influence. I mean, everybody eats them, et cetera, et cetera.
right.
And I believe it's tapirs. I don't know, TAPIR, the little pachyderms. Um, they're one of the primary movers of Brazil nuts. So you could argue that the tapirs are the creators of the Amazon rainforest by carrying the Brazil nuts around. So
Right.
so that ends up being a really complicated thing. But now back to your question. Um, there are arguments, and we can certainly go this direction, that uh, the problem really started with agriculture,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
there's a fundamental change happens when you perceive the world, when you convert the entire land base into food for humans. And a couple things happen when you do that. One of them is that you destroy the capacity of the land to support anybody else. And the other is by converting all that productivity, by which I mean the Brazil nuts that could be eaten by the tapirs, if you convert those to human use, then not only does that harm the Brazil nuts and the tapirs, but it also makes it so you can have more humans there.
Right.
So your human population can go up, but a couple things happen. One is that if you can create a storage, and if you get an excess of grain, that means somebody can steal it. And if somebody can steal it, that means you have to have a way to protect it.
Right.
And so that leads to, but you have extra people, which means you can feed the extra people, which means you can have a class of people whose job it is to protect stuff. And we call those soldiers. And then the next step is that by converting the entire land base into human use, you degrade the capacity of the land to support humans or non-humans in the future. So what happens is once you commit yourself to that way of life, you exceed carrying capacity, and then you continue to degrade carrying capacity. So you have a choice. Either A, you can voluntarily give it up, B, you can collapse, or C, you can conquer somebody else's territory. And the good news for you is that you have a standing army because you've got the excess. And so if you've cut down your forests and turned them into war chariots, you're going to have a competitive advantage over your navy. Over your neighbor. And then you can conquer them and you start the process over. And this isn't all theoretical, because the first written myth of Western civilization is Gilgamesh deforesting the hills and valleys of Iraq in order to make a great city. And we'll talk about the cities in a second. And the Arabian Peninsula was oak savanna. The Near East was heavily forested. We've all heard of the Cedars of Lebanon. They still have one on their flag. Greece was heavily forested. One of the dead Greek guys, I think it was Plato, was complaining that deforestation was harming water quality. And I'm reasonably sure that the Greek government said we need to study this for a few years and make sure there's really a correlation. But anyway, the forests of North Africa were felled to create the Egyptian and Phoenician navies. And that, of course, gave them an advantage over others. So once you start this process, it becomes really a self-perpetuating cycle. So that was the first direction I want to go with this. The second direction I want to go with this is, I said earlier that civilization is inherently unsustainable. And that's nice, Derrick, but what is civilization? Because some people think civilization is all human culture, but I define civilization as a way of life that's characterized by the growth of cities. And that's defensible both linguistically and historically. Linguistically, because civilization comes from the root meaning root kivitetos, which means state or city. And also, when we think about it historically, people talk about the rise of civilization, always talking about cities, Gilgamesh, the Near Eastern cities. But that's nice, Derrick, but what's a city? So a city I've defined as people living in numbers large enough to require the importation of resources.
Okay.
And that's to separate them from villages, camps, etc. But two things happen as soon as you require being the key word. As soon as you require the importation of resources, it means your way of life can never be sustainable. Because if you require the importation of resources, it means you've denuded the landscape of that particular resource. And so as your city grows, there will be an ever larger area that you need to take from. And you need to put wastes on. I mean, New York City, where do they get their wood? Where do they get their brick? Where do they get their water? Where do they put their poop? And we know where they put their poop, by the way. They used to put it in the ocean, and now they ship it by rail to some county in Alabama.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And so anyway, if you have a city, it is going to need an ever larger. So when I was a baby environmentalist, this is 1989 or something. I remember sitting with a friend who was a more experienced environmentalist, sitting at dinner, and he drew on the napkin. He put a little circle in the center, and they said, "This is a city." And then he put a bigger circle, and he said, "This is the area the city needs to draw from." And as the city grows, it needs to draw from an ever larger area. And so, again, if you require the importation of resources, your way of life can never be sustainable. And the second thing it means is your way of life must be based on violence. Because if you require the importation of resources and the next people in the next watershed over won't trade you, you'll take them. This isn't like trading buffalo robes for shells, sort of luxuries or extra things that you don't need. This is if you require, again, require is the key word.
Yeah.
It means we could all have this wonderful spiritual attitude. It doesn't matter, because if you require oil to run your economy, you're not going to let the oil economy. We could all become just, the most pacifistic, personally wonderful people in the world. You still need oil. You still need the wood. You still
Right.
need the gold and the copper and everything else.
Right.
So and then there's one more direction we can go. But if you want to ask another question, we can hold off on the other one. Whatever you want to do.
Well, in thinking about that, and then correlate with civilization, starting with agriculture, something in the Hebrew alphabet, the first letter is a plow, to mean that the beginnings of civilization is the ability to farm, and then the next one is the house. The next letter stands for the house. So it kind of tells you, first we start farming, and then we start building these structures, and we stay put. I think the Mayans had an idea that they did utilize, which was that at a certain point in time, their civilization would get to a point where it wasn't sustainable, and they had to give the keys back to the jungle, give civilization keys back to the jungle, basically putting the temples and all their cities, into overgrowth, and then they would disappear back into the jungle. Which I believe they had to follow that based on their resources being limited, or maybe it was a drought or something like that.
Well, it's interesting. When I said that they have these three choices, they can either collapse, voluntarily change their way of life, or conquer others. I wasn't saying those rhetorically. Those are actually choices that and there have been cultures who have chosen each one of those.
Right.
And and I was thinking of, and I'm not an archaeologist, so I don't know for sure, but I've heard the same stories about the Mayans that they actually said, this isn't really working, so let's
we give up.
Yeah, and the advantage they had is that the nearby lands had been not destroyed enough that they actually could go back to subsistence farming.
Yeah.
And we are not really faced with that. They weren't in as great as an overshoot as we are.
Correct. Yeah, we're at a point where we could almost say that the planet has never sustained this type of culture. There may have been previous cultures, but they were nothing ever like this.
Well, they weren't global.
Global.
Even among the American Indians, there were the mound builders. There have been there were the Aztecs.
Right.
There have been civilizations in the Americas, the Incas, and they did. Every civilization follows the same route of building up, basically destroying the soil. There's that line people say about families that if mom ain't happy, then ain't nobody happy.
Right.
And the way this applies ecologically is if the soil isn't happy, then ain't nobody happy.
Right.
The soil is the basis for terrestrial life.
I've seen a meme going around, which is that you grow beans and corn and squash together, and you are giving the proper balance of nutrients from each one. But I think you can only, again, do that within a certain amount of years in the same soil bed. You'd have to keep moving the garden.
Well, a question that. Okay, I'm gonna throw out a number here, but I want people to know that I don't know this number. My memory is bad enough. I don't remember what it is. But people have asked before, what is the carrying capacity of a reasonably fertile region of human beings?
Yeah.
And I think it's like 1 or 2 people per square mile. It's
wow.
can.
That's amazing.
And I could be off. Let's say I'm off by a factor of 10,
Right.
So let's say it's 10 or 20 people per square mile. The point is, it's not. So yes, you could have beans and squash if you have a fairly small area that's devoted to that. And then, and as you said, you move it in 20 years, and then that's why there are annual plants, is to cover over. Annual plants are kind of like scabs. They're the first responders who just cover over a wounded area. So there's a plant in the Western United States called fireweed And one reason it's called that is because, well, two reasons. One is that when you have a hillside of it, it looks like fire because it's all red. And the other reason is that it's usually one of the first plants who comes in after a fire. And
Okay.
so you have a big fire, and then you got fireweed come in, and it's going to help keep the soil in place until the perennials can start their job of really doing the long-term holding of soil together. And so it's the same thing. You could have beans and corns and squash, and then you decide to move over 3 miles somewhere, or a half a mile, or however far, and then the annuals come in, and then a couple of years later, the perennials start moving in. And I mean, succession is a beautiful thing.
Yeah, right. Actually changing instead of doing the same thing over and over again is a good thing. It seems to be part of what a lesson on this planet would be, is that everything changes in life in general, and it'd be good to adjust things and allow things to recompensate before, kind of like in a rhythmic pattern.
I remember when I interviewed Thomas Berry back in 1993 or 2 or something, and he himself he'd been an environmentalist. I think he was born in 1912 or something. He was, I remember when I interviewed him, he said he remembered when automobiles came into North Carolina, and he didn't like it. He didn't like their effects. Anyway, so the point is, he was an elder at that point. And one of the things I said to him is, so nature wants to be in sort of a state of dynamic equilibrium, right? And he said, no, he thinks it wants to be in a state of creative disequilibrium. And we could have an entire discussion about what that means, and I still don't know. But I think I'm thinking about what you just said about, I mean, I think there are places that are in sort of an equilibrium, but then things get stirred up by, I want to tell a story, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Which is that years ago, so hold on, what's the carrying capacity of humans in a healthy forest? What was it?
It's like 1 per square mile.
Yeah, it's about 1 per square mile.
1 per square mile. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's wild. It's not a lot.
No, it's not a lot. Anyway, so years ago, I was writing about how there are 2 million dams in the United States. That includes itty bitty dams. 2 million dams in the United
2
States.
million dams. Wow.
Yeah, 60,000 dams over 2 meters tall, so that's 13 feet, and 70,000 dams over 1 meter tall, that's 3.5 feet. And I was talking about how, if we only remove one of those dams every day, it would take 200 years to remove all those 1 meter dams.
Right.
And so I'm going on about this, and there was this hydrologist said to me, gosh, Derrick, you can't talk about taking out dams, because taking out a dam is the worst thing you can do, because it causes a big flood and it'll just destroy the river. I didn't know. So I started asking people. And the first thing I would do is I would call up people and I would say, hey, so if I took out a dam, would that be good or bad for the river? Hello? They'd hang up on me, because obviously it's crazy talk.
Yeah.
But so I'd call them back, and I this time, after enough time had passed, they'd forgotten about me. I'd call them back, and I said, okay, so it's 100 years from now, the electrical grid has collapsed, and people in your community are asking you whether it's better to take out a dam all at once or to wait until it fails eventually, because all dams will fail eventually.
Yeah.
And no humans are going to get harmed. Is this better for the river? And this is going to have a point in the end. And they all said the same thing, which is take it out now. And they also said, a dam breaking is just a big flood, and rivers flood all the time.
Right.
And they were also saying that an individual dam is not a big deal, because rivers get dammed all the time. They get dammed by mudslides, they get dammed by volcanoes, they get dammed by ice, all this stuff. The problem is that you got 2 million dams in the United States. It's no big deal to have one dam here. Of course, it's going to harm that river, but it'll eventually fail. Anyway, the point is, one of these people I called was a fisheries biologist for a river that's undammed. And she said it floods all the time. And every time it floods, she said, it breaks her heart, because it kills deer, it kills fish, it kills salamanders, kills trees. But also every time it floods, it makes her really happy, because it creates all sorts of new habitat. And first off, I have to say also, we misdefine rivers. That rivers don't flow in channels. Rivers ride across the landscape like snakes. That comes back to
Yeah.
your point about everything changing.
Right.
That if you have you seen those wonderful maps of the Mississippi River and how all it's like different colors for where it went different years back in 1800 to 1850?
I
It's
haven't.
just beautiful.
Yeah.
It goes everywhere.
Yeah, I'll bet it
Um,
does. Yeah. Before it was basically
cha-
corralled, you know.
yes, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So the point of this whole story is she said that every time a river floods, it's short-term habitat loss for long-term habitat gain.
Hmm.
And
Okay. Yeah,
I
exactly. Yeah.
and a couple things. One is as a metaphor, that's like, why do we stay in bad relationships? Why do we stay in bad jobs? Because of the fear of short-term habitat loss for long-term habitat gain. This
Hmm.
is what motivates so much uh, misery, frankly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then on the ecological scale, this comes back, and the reason I wanted to tell the story is because it makes the point you were making about how, just this state of change, that a river doesn't stay in one channel. It jumps over here, which of course harms the trees and salamanders and everybody over here,
Hmm.
but it's what a river does. It's
That's
what
what
it
it
has to
does.
do.
Right. Flux, I think, would be a good word. There's an all constant flux, and it seems that nature likes that constant flux. That there's equilibrium in being able to harmonize with the flux. There's something about rivers flooding. I want to say Tigris Euphrates, I believe that was one of the main proponents that allowed for the Fertile Crescent to be there was the flooding waters, and the same with the Nile River. The mud that would get flooded out of the Nile was what allowed that civilization to exist there for as long as it did.
Yep.
That would be a factor. And definitely, I know myself, traveling along I believe it's the Columbia River between Oregon and Washington. And I definitely thought, well, why is that dam there? Wouldn't it be nice to just let the river go and let it do its thing in a natural way? I know it's probably saving some houses down the way, from being flooded, but that's something about damming the vital life force of the earth, something that's in constant flux. And I was in Phoenix, Arizona, and this was in 90 something, and they had dammed the river. And I thought, you dam the river in the desert? There was no water that ran through this empty river channel. It was completely dry, and I thought, this is a desert. This is not a good place to be taking the water away from the resource for all the species. Just in general, it seems like a really bad practice.
Well, it
Bad
is.
ecology.
And for the record, 25% of rivers no longer reach the ocean in the world.
Yeah, it's wild. Wild. Yeah, and
There's
that's
just in the past 30 years, there's been an ecological catastrophe that we don't think about much in the West, but the by mass, the largest migration of animals in the not in the ocean
mm,
uh, was the Mekong Delta catfish. There are
mm,
these huge, like 600-pound catfish, and they
oh,
would migrate up the river to spawn. And it was by mass greater than all those big herds we've seen on the Serengeti, greater than the bison.
wow.
And just in the last 30 years, their population has completely collapsed because of dams,
Mm,
especially upriver in China,
mm-hmm.
um, that change the flow of the river and disallow.
Yeah.
And people have known this forever. This is one of the things that just kills me is that I don't remember who it was, Robert the Bruce or somebody, some king from fairly old and in what is now somewhere in Britain or Scotland. There were a couple of kings who passed laws saying that you cannot obstruct the flow of any river in his kingdom.
Mm.
And it's like, this is 500 years ago, and now they put
Yeah.
in the dams on the Columbia and think that salmon are going to survive.
Wow. Yeah.
Oh, by the
Exactly.
way, want to
Exactly.
say one more thing about dams in the Columbia. I'm sorry, about
Yeah.
floods in the Columbia, which is when I was first questioning this whole thing. Is it right to talk about people taking out dams and floods really harm rivers? I was doing a radio program out of Olympia, Washington. I
Mm.
mean, a call-in show through Olympia,
Yeah.
and I was talking about this dilemma. It's like, well, I don't know if it's better to say take out dams. I had multiple callers call up and say, Derrick, Do you ever hear about the Missoula flood?
Hmm.
The
I don't know
Missoula
what that would be.
flood, 12,000 years ago. And there were like a number of Missoula floods. It's happened again and again. That
Okay.
there was during the last ice age, there was an ice dam formed up in western
Oh.
Montana,
Mm.
and it ended up eventually backing up so much water that the water lifted the glacier, and then it broke up. The glacier broke up, and there was, I believe, 6 times as much water flowing down the Columbia as that drained as the rest of the freshwater rivers in the world combined.
Wow.
Huge flood, and I never can
Wow.
remember if it was 200 feet deep and 60 miles an hour or 60 miles an hour and 200 feet deep, but it carried boulders the size of houses all the way
Mm.
down to Portland and then up the Willamette Valley.
Wow.
It
Now, I
was a
think
huge flood.
Randall Carlson goes into that a lot. It sounds very familiar. The Scablands or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, and all the coulees were made then,
Hmm.
and, this is, the point is that salmon survived that, sturgeon
Right.
survived that, the
Right.
regions survived that, the humans survived that,
Yeah.
and, individual humans, not so much, an individual salmon, individual sturgeon,
Right.
but the salmon
Culture.
as a community, which is a whole nother thing we can talk about if you want, which I love this line by, Paul Stamets, which is "Nature loves a community."
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
it seems to be that way, doesn't it?
I always think that when we talk about evolution, I think sometimes we're looking at the wrong primary unit. That we talk about it in terms of individual species. And yes, I think individual species should absolutely be protected. I'm not saying that. But because people will use that argument. But
Right.
what I'm saying is that what is important to nature is the functioning of the entire redwood forest community, or what is important is the entire salmon dependent community. And
Mm-hmm.
again, I don't take that to mean individual species aren't important, but what I take it to mean, unfortunately for us individuals, is that individuals aren't quite so important to nature. I mean, we live and die. We're expendable, literally.
Yeah.
Um, but what is important is the functioning, the ongoing functioning of this dynamic, I would call it a being, this dynamic larger being who is the forest or who is the river.
Mm-hmm.
Um, anyway, I'm sorry if I'm getting off topic.
No, 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 no. It's good. And I feel like with the forests, that's kind of it's an accepted thing that there's going to be a harmony or harmonious balance or a way of the woods, and that humans really should be trying to find their way to fit into that cycle rather than try to just chop the trees down and build a house.
Well, I love the line I heard many years ago, which was, when they talk about survival of the fit, they don't actually mean survival of the fittest, but instead survival of the way you fit into your community.
Mm,
People talk about how it's survival of the strongest, the best able to exploit their surroundings. But again, if you give me a couple semicolons, I think I can disprove that in one sentence,
yeah.
which is those creatures who've survived in the long run have survived in the long run, semicolon. You don't survive in the long run by hyper exploiting your surroundings, semicolon. You survive in the long run by actually improving your habitat.
Hmm.
So salmon improve the forest health by simply living and dying there.
Right.
And bears perform functions for the forest. And how you survive in the long term is by making your habitat better. How do we think? I don't know if you've read these. There's this great book, a horrifying book called
Hmm.
Sea of Slaughter by Farley Mowat, and
Hmm.
it basically consists of contemporary accounts of what North America was like prior to conquest.
Yeah.
And there would be flocks of passenger pigeons so large they darkened the sky for days at a time, and whales were a hazard to shipping because there were so many of them. And in
Hmm.
San Francisco Bay, um, and in some places off the coast of California and off the coast of Massachusetts, there would be so many whales. Evidently, whales have fairly bad breath, and there would be so many whales that the air would stink from their
Hmm.
breath. And it's just
Wow.
extraordinary.
Right.
And you mentioned Colombia. We've all heard stories of rivers so thick with salmon that they're black and roll. I have a picture at home that's still from Alaska. From somebody took it and sent it to me. It's from 2001 or something, of this river. And if you look at the banks, the edges of the river, you see a little bit of gold, and then the bottom of the river is black. And then
Mm.
if you look really closely, you see the reason the river is black is because it is literally full of salmon.
Wow.
You can't you cannot see the bottom of the river because of them. And that's how it was like all up and down the coast. And
Mm.
anyway, so Sea of Slaughter is all these different accounts of different beings, that if you look to the bottom of rivers or bottom of estuaries, you could see cod. You couldn't see the sand. You see nothing but cod.
Mm.
And cod,
Yeah.
there'd be banks of cod so thick that it would slow the passage of boats.
Wow.
Anyway, the point here is that how did the world get to be that way in the first place? It's
Right.
not by everybody exploiting, it's by everybody making the world a better place by living and dying. And that, by the way, is also central to all of my work. That I think that's the central moral question for me is how do I build up a morality? How do I understand morality? What is moral? And the question is really, did you leave the world a better place because you were born?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
By world, I mean the real
Yeah.
physical world. I don't necessarily mean the capitalist economy.
Yeah. Right. An imprint. Right. No. Yeah. I think I want to say that in thinking about that, there was the desire of Gilgamesh to achieve divinity, to go to heaven, to leave, and there's a lot of that mindset that is pervasive, which is that the reward is somewhere else, is that there's a goal to go somewhere else and to leave here. But it seems that if you're doing it right, you're looking at actions that you're going to be responsible for with a 10-year glance. In that idea that when you're making a decision, you want to look at the 10-year cycle of that decision to make sure it's still good. Is this a good decision 10 years from now? And that, I guess, is an idea for, are you leaving the place better when you leave? Um, I wanted to take a diversion from that almost in an opposite direction, but not so much. To get your thoughts on uh, modern technology, most specifically AI. There's a lot of talk a lot of fear with AI, but there's also a lot of talk that perhaps utilizing AI would help to manage this amount of people and the issues and problems that the people of Earth have, from being maybe all separate, all in our national countries, in our own little isolated areas, to being more unified and regulated by something that has the ability to regulate 8 billion people. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, there's not a lot of places we can go without going to um, loss of population. And if that doesn't happen, how do you manage 8 billion people, 8 billion parts of anything?
Well, a couple of things. One of them is I think that Facebook, Twitter, etc., show us that um, these sorts of non-face-to-face communications do nothing but create happiness and joy
Hmm.
and unity among people.
Right.
I'm totally sarcastic here.
Yeah.
Um, that I was just reading Graham Linehan's autobiography or memoir, and he was a big believer in how one of the examples he used of why he was so excited about Twitter at first was that he said, so the Beatles were great, and it's a coincidence that Paul McCartney and John Lennon grew up near each other and happened to know each other. And now with Twitter, you can have somebody from Liverpool work with somebody from Mumbai, and it's like it's not really how it's working out. So
Right.
there's that. Second is there's three directions I want to go. That was the first one. Second direction I want to go with that is that we always have to remember that we are in overshoot,
Hmm.
and someday the human population will be lower, and every cell in my body wants for this to happen in a reasonable fashion, in an orderly retreat.
Right.
And I don't see any evidence for that. And
Yeah. Right.
and so I wish it's the same with technology, that I wish we would uh, make an orderly sort of an orderly withdrawal from this continuous technological escalation. And I don't see it happening. And in
Yeah.
fact, I love there's one of the Doobie Brothers albums, and it's like, am I now so old that nobody knows who the Doobie Brothers is anymore? But anyway, the Doobie Brothers, a band from the 70s, they had an album called "What Were Once Vices Are Now Habits," and I think about that a lot, because only 120 years ago, um, industrial electricity was not very common. And excuse me, when they introduced the telephone, Carl Jung wrote about how much he hated telephones, because people can call you up at any time of the day and just interrupt you,
That's
and
true.
how it makes everything so fast. And he had this line in there about all haste is of the devil. And like, dude, you have no idea how bad it's going to get.
Right.
And um, so that is 100 years ago, people introducing telephones like, oh, that's ridiculous. And then now, if you took away people's Wi-Fi, there would be blood on the streets.
Yeah.
And so what there are these things that, and I grew up without Wi-Fi. I grew up without computers. I'm one of those dinosaurs. And I get it too. I mean, the internet goes out and it's like, oh my God, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll read a book or something. Anyway,
Right.
the point is that I actually I got off the point. The point I was trying to make was that we can have all the AI and all the management and all the everything else we want, but that doesn't alter the fact that humans have exceeded carrying capacity. And uh, and we can attempt to use technology to see, okay, I'll just say it. Okay, yes, carrying capacity or overshooting carrying capacity consists of two things. One of them is too many humans. The other is too much technology and too much resource consumption. Same diff as too much technology in many
Right.
ways.
Okay.
And people always act like, oh no, the problem isn't too many people. It's too much technology, it's too much consumption by Americans or Canadians, because they consume more than we do. So let's blame them. Um, that was a joke. We're all
No,
the
I'm saying.
same. Anyway, so either that or they'll
All from the same
go,
resource. Yeah.
yeah. So they'll try to break it apart, but the truth is, it's both are problems. And I one reason I know that the primary concern that's expressed by those in power, whatever that means, about population is bogus, is that when birth rates in Russia or Japan fall and they go below replacement level, they freak out, because they say, oh my gosh, our economy is going to collapse because we have to continue to have growth. And so they do things like have sex holidays where they send people home to have sex so that they hope to have babies.
Wow.
And so that's one reason that many people rightly consider a concern about overpopulation to be racist, because even though race doesn't really work since Japan is not white, but it's classist. Because when in
Classist, yeah.
industrialized nations people stop having babies, it's a problem. But in
Right.
non-industrialized nations, when they do have a baby, it's a problem. It's like that. But that doesn't alter the fact that stupid analysis doesn't alter the fact that there's more people on the planet that we can support. So it doesn't matter how you manage. And then further, one of the management techniques I'm sure would be a better distribution of, say, for example, food resources. But there's always going to be unintended consequences, or perhaps intended consequences. And one of the things I mean by that is that most of the people I know, or most people I've worked with in, for example, Mexico or wherever, they were opposed to NAFTA. And they've been opposed to, we think it's a great idea to export US food to some starving nation, but what ends up happening is that ends up destroying their local food networks.
Right.
And so they get all sorts of corn from Iowa. All of a sudden, the people who are happily growing corn for their community can no longer meet those prices. They can't make a living. And so they end up moving to North America to, take crap jobs in the Central Valley. It's
Right.
just, it ends up, and I'm not sure that better management is going to solve that. So
Yeah.
the second thing is that physical reality, no matter what we talk about with management, the wood has to come from somewhere for New York City. And as long as you got more people, it's going to be more wood, it's going to be more food, it's going to be more water, going to be more poop produced. So management can do some good, and then the third thing is that this might be a good time to talk about Lewis Mumford and authoritarian and democratic technics. And I want to introduce the term technic. It's not mine, it's Lewis Mumford's. TECHNIC. And some of his analysis was that technologies don't emerge in a vacuum, that they emerge from a certain mindset and they lead to a certain mindset. I live on Tolowa land. The Tolowa lived here for at least 12,500 years, and they never invented refrigerators. And it's not because they were too stupid to invent refrigerators. It's just there were so many salmon. Why bother? You don't need, food stays fresher in the stream anyway, and there's no need for it. So you have to have a certain mindset to create a certain technology. And then also, once you create a technology, it's going to lead to a certain mindset. And a great example of this is the other day I was at the grocery store, which is about 2 miles from where I live. I drove home and I realized, oh, shoot, I forgot toilet paper. So I drove back to the grocery store. If I didn't have a car, I would have taken a list.
Right.
But because I have a car and because it's 2 miles, like, who cares? And so technology changes how you perceive the world. And he argued, and I really agree with this, and there's a very short essay called Authoritarian and Democratic Technics, maybe 10 pages long. I really recommend people read it, written in the 60s, about how technics can really be either democratic or authoritarian. And they can spring from and lead to either a democratic power structure or authoritarian power structure. And it's pretty easy that if it's a thing that, okay, examples will make it clear. So pottery is a democratic technique because nobody can control your access to clay or mud.
Gotcha.
And same with bows and arrows. If you control my source of bows and arrows, if I have the knowledge, I can make them myself.
Right.
On the other hand, if you have something that requires metal, if you have metal pots, if you have guns, and the point is, bows and arrows are still weapons, so it's not weapon or not. But if you have guns, that means that in order to have a mine, you have to have a police and military system to enforce it. Oh, here's a great example. Somebody was interviewing me 10 years ago. And he said he was a dedicated Marxist who believed that it was possible to have an industrial economy with no exploitation of anyone, purely voluntary exchanges everywhere. And I said, do you have cities? And he said, yes. I said, okay, how do you get around in your cities? He said, by buses. I said, great. What are your buses made of? He said, metal. I said, great. So how do you get people to work in the mines? And he said, well, you pay them. I said, well, mining is such a horrible existence that it was one of the first forms of slavery. And it's just dreadful, but I'm going to give that to you. I'll give you just pay them exorbitant amounts of money, not exploiting them. But every hard rock mine on the planet has polluted groundwater, every single one.
Right.
So I said, what do you do about the people who live next to the mine? He said, you pay them to leave. I said, what if they won't leave? They don't want to leave. He said, well, you pay them more. I said, no, they've lived here for 5,000 years and their ancestors are buried here and they refuse to leave. What do you do? He said, how many are there? I said, I don't know, 500. What difference does it make? He said, well, the 1 million people in the city vote, and they vote that those 500 people have to be evicted. And I say, oh, so you've gone from purely voluntary exchanges within less than a minute to land theft from indigenous people, perhaps genocide,
right,
and democratic empire, authoritarianism. Also, you can have a mine. And the point is that if you have a mine, that means you have to have a police system to protect it because people are going to steal the mined material.
Yeah.
And you have to have a military in order to take the land for the mine. You got to kick the people off. That's not even including non-humans. So Mumford's argument, we basically summarized, 15 books of Lewis Mumford right here in 3 sentences or something. That basically, if you have, except he's much smarter than we are, or than I am at least, and he, so he argued that some technologies lead to certain authoritarianism. So the way this ties back to AI is that, oh, and one more thing, he said that also the authoritarian techniques were authoritarian because they end up in charge. They actually end up in charge, not us. And I know that sounds crazy, but think about it. Are cities designed for human beings or for cars?
Yeah, right.
They're designed for cars.
Are definitely designed for cars, yeah.
And we keep talking about, oh my gosh, fossil fuels are going to destroy the planet. And it's like, okay, it's destroying the planet. Can we just stop? It's like, no. Why not? Because the fossil fuels are in charge.
Right.
I mean, it's not some sort of cosmic thing where the machines are going, ha, ha, ha. Instead, it's just that we end up valuing, we have this bribe that they give to us. They deliver to us, the technologies, deliver all these things. They deliver the ability for you and I to talk at a long distance. They deliver strawberries in January, things that look like strawberries, at least in January. And in exchange for everything else, in exchange for giving up everything else. So the point is that when we talk about AI, so I had a computer. I have the worst computer, the stupidest computer store in the world. I spilled chicken teriyaki on my computer and it destroyed it. Most expensive chicken teriyaki I've ever had.
Right.
So then I had to get a new computer, but everything had crapped out, except the hard drive was still good. So I put the hard drive in the new computer. The first thing it did is ask for my BitLocker key. I was like, I have no idea. And then after that, it said, well, you can get your BitLocker key by signing into your Microsoft account. And I'm not some like conspiracy theorist, Bill Gates, the devil. I mean, I don't like Bill Gates, but the point is that I spent like hours. I couldn't remember my Microsoft password.
Yeah.
I had it saved on my computer.
It was saved on the computer. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so my point is that it all resolved nicely in this case. But the point is that Microsoft actually controlled my access to all of my manuscripts.
Right.
And because it's so convenient for me, I mean, with a lesser technology, with less high technology, if they were just in stacks of paper, yes, that's really inconvenient, but I still control it.
Right. It's a manageable resource, basically.
And nobody can take my access to it. And in this case, again, I'm not saying that Microsoft wanted to steal my manuscripts, but simply because I couldn't I couldn't remember the password.
Yeah.
Like I could have lost everything.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so my point is that when we talk about AI in this way, it kind of cracks me up when people say, oh, we're going to live forever. We're going to merge with the machines and then we'll like upload our consciousness to the computer. It's like, have you ever had a computer crash?
Right.
What happens if the grid crashes? It's like, so they're all dependent on this whole complex. Oh, I want to go one more direction here for a second, okay, I'm not going to get into the whole COVID thing. That's not my point here. But what I do want to say, which I think is really fascinating, is I was fascinated by the whole COVID thing. Again, I don't care about any other stuff right here, but I started following it about a week or so, or 10 days after Wuhan shut down, because after Wuhan shut down, 10 days later or somewhere, a Hyundai factory in South Korea shut down because they could no longer get parts from Wuhan.
Oh,
and it's the point is that this whole industrial economy is so highly interdependent.
Yeah.
And if you cut off, it's extraordinary to me that people's lives were affected in South Korea because of a city shutting down, I don't know, 1,500 miles away or something. And I know this was not the question, but people ask me, what lesson have I learned from the whole COVID shutdown thing? And I don't think those in power have learned this, but it's like relocalize food supplies.
Right.
And it's the same thing is true with the coming of collapse. It doesn't matter whether it's going to come through peak oil or through anything else, like relocalize food supplies. That's my answer to every question.
Yeah.
Who do you think's going to win the Super Bowl? Relocalize food supplies. Because ultimately all this large, the reason I'm talking about this with AI is because at some point this way of life can't continue. And at some point we're still going to have to eat.
Yeah.
And there's a great line by Jung, which is philosophy butters no parsnips.
Hmm.
And I would say technology butters no parsnips. Sure, it can help move it can help move parsnips all over the world, but when the grid goes down,
Yeah,
you're going to want some
exactly.
parsnips locally. It's not going to help you if you have parsnips 300 miles away.
Right. And that's, I believe there's somebody that's somewhat popular right now, Steve Zahn, who is also talking about how there is going to be a diminishment of population and economical change that has to happen where the countries need to get more regional. That the network between Mexico and the United States and Canada needs to become more tight knit rather than relying on massive ships shipping to and fro from across the way.
Okay, this is crazy. This is absolutely crazy. And this well, I read it on the internet, so it must be true. But I did hear this from a reliable source that they take chickens from horrible factory farms in Arkansas, ship them to China to be processed,
Yeah,
and then bring them back to the United States to be eaten.
yeah, something
That's
like that.
nuts.
Yeah,
That's completely nuts.
yeah, yeah. It is, and that's just one example of many things very similar to that. I did want to touch on one more thing before I let you go, and that would be this coming awareness of external forces and entities from outside that seem to have been here all along. And I'm talking about the extraterrestrial, the aliens, that sort of thing. There's been a lot of talk about that as far as what's going to happen in the future, how that's going to look. And then, of course, if you dive into it a little bit, it does seem that the message being brought forth is that uh, the Earthlings need to love their Earth a little bit more and be careful of their resources and their environment, and kind of become more environmentalists almost before they step foot in a kind of open way. That the people need to kind of get it together a little bit more and take care of what they have. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing that occurs to me is that it doesn't really matter whether that message comes from extraterrestrials or from trees or from God or from the goddess or from, I mean, it's just, that's a sound message.
Yeah,
And
right.
I'm always, I mean, this is, I don't really think about extraterrestrials very much. But I don't mind, if I can use this language, I don't mind discussing woo things a little bit. I'm, for crying out loud, I wrote an entire book about whether the muse actually does exist or whether
Hmm.
that's an extension of my unconscious, and I
Yeah,
fall on the actual existing thing. But it doesn't really matter to me where it comes from. That
right.
that the important thing, now the muse, I hope the muse doesn't get mad at me for saying it doesn't
Oh.
matter whether it's, yeah, but the point is that I mean, there have been plenty of times when I have been walking through a forest and I will be stuck writing and I'll say, I need I need some help here, and I'll get some help. And
Hmm.
it doesn't matter. I have friends who are Christian who would say that was God.
Right.
I say it's the trees and the muse. There's one that I wrote this piece that's the most beautiful thing I've ever written, called Pretend You're a River. It's in my book Endgame. And uh, I always say that I wrote that, that the most beautiful thing I ever written was not written by me. It was written by a river. That I was trying to figure out, what is it like to be, I wanted to write something from the perspective, what's it like to be a river? And I tried for months and or weeks and I couldn't do it. And
Hmm.
then I thought, well, this is silly. I live 50 yards from a stream. So I walked down to the stream. I said, what's it like to be you? Boom. I got the
Hmm.
whole thing. And
Yeah.
I just ran inside and wrote it down as fast as I could. So my point is, we could say that was the unconscious. We could say it was the muse. I think in this case, it was actually the stream, but it doesn't matter to me.
Right.
Does it make sense?
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah.
And so
The
the
sounding board. I call it the sounding board, and it doesn't matter what it is, but you do have to sound it out, and you
and
will get a response.
yeah, I
Yeah.
completely agree with that. And we could do a whole discussion on that if you wanted. That's that's also really important because we don't have to do this all alone. You don't have to. There's. I'm going to see if I can find this quote that's not by me, that I just love, which is hold on. Okay, this is by Tom Prideaux. It's in a book called The World of Delacroix, the painter. The romantic intelligence was sharply aware of antithesis and groped toward synthesis. In contrast to today's existentialists, who holds that in a world devoid of meaning, it is man's job to create his own meanings, the romantic felt that the world was full of meanings if he could only see it whole. With his do-it-yourself kit, the existentialist must make his own universe. The romantic assumed that God had already done a lot of the work. And there's a line by Albrecht Dürer, the painter, or the artist, the engraver, that is basically, art is implicit in nature. Whoever can see it has it, basically.
Right. I think I've
And
heard that one. Yeah.
Does that make sense with your question? Does that tie back to your question? That
Well, a little bit. I mean, there's been a lot of revelations that there are species that do exist outside of this world. And I don't necessarily mean dimensionally, but of course there's a lot of talk of that too. So it does reference that, but more specifically, that there's a need for the people of Earth to get it together, to learn how to break the barriers down, stop the war, learn how to live more in a harmonious way. I believe your answer to that would be that the population has to be diminished by a significant amount before there could be any kind of approach of that kind of harmony.
Well, and again, every cell, I'm not saying that I think there should be forced abortions. I'm not saying, what I'm saying is kind of like a doctor that's like, we have a condition and I want, it's like emphysema. It's like, you might first consider quitting smoking. There are things we could do, like the number one thing to reduce birth rate is around the world, is to teach girls to read. Because if they even have that level of independence and empowerment, they usually choose to have fewer babies and to have them later.
Right.
So a lot of this stuff again, when people talk about reducing population, they usually talk about really draconian things. But the truth is, if you ask most people in the world, they only want a couple kids.
Right.
They don't want to have, most don't want to have 8 or 9. And so really all we have to do to stop overpopulation is to stop the capitalist growth imperative. There's that authoritarian technique again.
Right.
And also take on the patriarchal sky god who, thinks that men should control women's reproduction. But back to your original point, yes, we have to. The fact that we're an overshoot doesn't mean that we can't do things on personal and collective scales to try to. There's a friend of mine, the guy who put the thing on the napkin 30 years ago. He says that as things become increasingly chaotic, he wants to make sure that some doors remain open. What he means by that is a bull trout are still alive in 10 years. They may be around in 100, but if they're gone in 10, they're gone forever.
Right.
And so there are things we can do. We can devote our lives to trying to protect what we love. The way I sign one of my books is I can't remember. The way I sign one of my books is find what you love, defend your beloved. And it doesn't matter what it is. Like you said at the beginning of this, or I don't know if we had started recording yet or not, but you said, I think before the beginning, that you wanted for this to be long form answers. One of the things that is under assault by Twitter, Facebook, etc., by TV, is long form thinking.
Yeah.
And one of the things I desperately want to do is to, as well as defending salamanders and frogs and forests and bears and all of them, I also want to defend long form thinking, because these are not issues that can be answered in sound bites. And these are not areas that can be explored. These are discussions we need to have that last days and weeks and months to figure out, okay, what are we going to do about overshoot? What's the best thing? What are we going to do about the fact that, so we're dependent on technologies, and it's like Daniel Quinn says that one of our problems is we have become dependent for our very lives on the system that's killing the planet. That is a discussion that I want us to be having in public every day, and to come up with whatever we can do. And so no matter what you love, is probably under assault. Another great example, I knew this guy, it didn't work out, but I knew this guy who, in the tiny little town where I lived, he opened a bookstore. I mean, independent bookstores are under assault.
Yeah, right.
And so, whatever, again, it doesn't just have to be red-legged frogs. It can also be independent bookstores. So the deal I did, which didn't work out in the end, but the deal I did with him is I said, I commit to buying one book a month from you because I want to support independent bookstores.
Yeah.
So we can do stuff like that, supporting whether, a local food networks,
Right.
So years ago, there was a CSA here in town, community supported agriculture. And I don't even eat that many vegetables, but I bought a box. I mean, I bought the weekly box, and I would usually give all the, a lot of the kale away. I would eat the potatoes, but like, I don't even eat kale, but I didn't care. I was going to support the CSA. So I think there's all, whatever is important to you. And here's another thing, just no matter what it is, get off your butt and do it. And,
action.
And I'll tell one more story here, which is that the smartest decision I ever made was in my 20s. I knew the problems were really big, that we're in big trouble environmentally. I knew that things are just getting worse. And I realized I wasn't paying enough for gas. And I can't do anything about the larger scale problems, but I don't know. It's so big. I don't know. So I didn't do anything because I didn't know what to do. And I realized I'm not paying enough for gas and to cover the environmental and social costs. So I decided this: for every dollar I spent on gas, I was going to give $1 to a local environmental organization, but I didn't have any money. And so I also said that I could pay myself $5 an hour to do activism. So back then it would cost $10 to fill your tank. And those were the days. Anyway, peak oil, my friend. Anyway, if I would fill my tank once a week, that meant I had to do 2 hours of activism that week. And I started off writing letters to the editor. And I was so scared that I would use fake names because I was way too scary. And then I moved from there to doing anti-fur demo, anti-circus demo. I just knew circuses are bad. I didn't know why. And I just showed up, and I didn't bring a sign or anything. I just showed up. They handed me a sign. I was like, circuses are bad. And somebody would come up and say, why are circuses bad? And I say, talk to the guy next to me. It's like, there's a great line by Florence Nightingale. I attribute my success to the fact that I never gave nor took an excuse. And there were no excuses. If I spend $10 on gas, I'm doing 2 hours of activism. And within, I don't know, 6 months, I was having so much fun with the activism, I couldn't keep track. And so the reason I think that's one more thing is that I don't write books. I can't write books because writing a book is too big and scary. But what I can do is I can write a page. And then tomorrow I can write a page.
Right.
And the day after I can write a page. And then in a year I got a book. There's a line from my great grandma, which is, and it's a cliche, but inch by inch, life's a cinch, yard by yard, life's hard. And we can't stop all these problems all at once. But what you can do is you can start your radio program. And you can do that. You can do that today. And then, you can also, you see that there's a demo against nuclear weapons. You can show up and hold a sign that somebody else makes for you. So my big thing is find what you love and then just do it.
Defend it. Yeah.
Defend it.
And shop local. It sounds like that's another important thing. Keep it local and act.
Yep.
Yeah, I like that. Now, where can everybody find your books?
Um,
Imagine Amazon and whatnot. But are there
well,
local bookshops that'll be able
well,
to order them?
um, yeah, I was going to say, if you happen to live where there's a local bookstore, you can certainly
Yeah.
get it there. Um, and otherwise, Amazon, the evil empire.
Hmm.
Um, Amazon sells, I read this like a year or two ago. Amazon sells, I believe, more than 50% of the books in the United States.
Gosh.
And that's
Wow.
another example of an authoritarian technic,
Yeah.
because I don't care what your politics are. If you control
Hmm.
more than 50% of the
Yeah.
books, if you decide not to carry a book, or if you decide to unpromote it or whatever to make it difficult to buy it, that's a completely non-democratic.
Right.
And I don't care if some local bookstore, of course, a local bookstore can decide what they're going to not going to carry. But this is kind of like, once you control 50% of the books that are sold in the United States, you become almost a public utility,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Of knowledge.
a
Yeah.
public utility of knowledge, which is
Right.
horrifying.
Yeah. Definitely.
A
Well, it's
private
similar
entity
to
that's a,
libraries. It's like, well, now we're not carrying this book anymore. Oh, okay.
yeah,
Hold on a minute. Yeah.
yeah. And I'm really very, yes, yeah, I completely agree with you.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for being here tonight, and really great discussion.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And thanks for your great questions.
Hey, thank you. Take care.